is Mizuno. Today we're going to be learning about the carbon cycle. It's one of the biogeochemical cycles that we'll be learning about in the next couple weeks. By the end of this video and the lessons in class, you should be able to explain and understand and answer any questions that have to do with our objectives. The first objective is that you understand where carbon travels in its cycle. Also, you need to be able to explain where carbon is stored. We actually call these reservoirs, but we'll get to that later. Remember, when watching the video, it is a great idea to rewind if you miss something, or pause the video if you need to jot something down. But do not fast forward, as you'll miss something very important. So stick to rewinding, pause, and play. Let's get started. Before we begin our tour on the carbon cycle, I'd like to remind you that a biogeochemical cycle is where we look at how carbon step by step goes through the different parts of the Earth's systems. Now remember that a biogeochemical cycle does not just pertain to carbon. We've also got a couple other biogeochemical cycles that we'll look at. We'll look at oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus as well. The first thing about the carbon cycle is that it will move through all of the Earth's spheres. Actually, it'll move through the biosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere. Remember that the biosphere is where we actually live, and plants change carbon dioxide into oxygen, and that the atmosphere is where the gases are held and it protects us from the Earth, and the hydrosphere is all the water on this planet. As carbon changes and goes from one step to another, it might involve chemical changes. A chemical change is best described as something that is undoable, but we'll get into a more scientific definition later. For right now, just remember that a chemical change is like when you take a piece of wood and burn it. You can't change the ash back into the original wood. You can't change carbon back into the original form, but at some point, when it goes through its cycle, it might end up back in the same spot. Remember that the carbon cycle actually is able to move carbon through different materials, and as it moves materials, it becomes different forms of carbon. Look at different types of carbon, like carbon dioxide, which we've already talked about, and it will actually become part of possibly granite and limestone, and fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide, remember, is the opposite of the oxygen cycle. Oxygen, remember, we write out as O2, and oxygen is what we breathe in and what our body needs in order to survive, but we also give off the waste product of carbon dioxide. So it's a cyclical event where carbon dioxide and oxygen end up trading places a lot of the time. This is the picture of carbon cycle that's actually found in your books, and it shows with the two types of arrows. It shows the red arrow in this key as CO2 actually entering the atmosphere. And it does this in a variety of ways. It can actually be when fossil fuels are burned, it releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Whenever a land organism breathes out, carbon is placed back into the atmosphere, as well as when marine animals or marine organisms breathe out. Processes like volcanic activity, weathering of carbonate rock, and the burning and decay of biomass are all ways that carbon dioxide can actually enter the atmosphere. The second arrow actually shows how CO2 leaves the atmosphere, and those include processes like deposition of carbonate sediments, how CO2 dissolves into seawater, the photosynthesis of marine organisms, as well as the photosynthesis of land vegetation, when we bury any biomass, and the weathering of granite. So these are just a few ways that CO2 enters and exits the atmosphere. Okay, so now we're going to focus on how carbon is stored, and we actually call that a reservoir. And a reservoir is a place where carbon is stored or kept until it is needed or moved by another process. There's actually 5 reservoirs that we're going to focus on today, and the first reservoir that we're focusing on is the atmosphere. Carbon is actually stored in the atmosphere in carbon dioxide, and we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And one of the ways that carbon dioxide actually leaves the atmosphere is when a plant uses it for the photosynthesis process. The second type of reservoir is the oceans, and oceans actually hold carbon dioxide as well, but it's dissolved in the sea salt. And the way that oceans actually allow it to enter the atmosphere is also through photosynthesis of the marine organisms like algae. The third type of reservoir is biomass, and that's really all organic material, all living things. A biomass is considered a short-term reservoir because realistically it's only in the organism's lifetime that the carbon exists in the biomass itself. One of the ways that we can release carbon from its biomass is through decay. So once an organism dies, carbon is actually released from it. The fourth type of reservoir that we can talk about is fossil fuels and coal. And fossil fuels and coal are actually take millions of years for carbon to turn into coal itself. So this is actually considered a long-term storage. Remember, this all relates back to Earth and Earth as a whole. The last type of reservoir is the carbonate rocks, and the carbonate rocks are going to be made from calcium carbonate. And the way to get carbon out of the carbonate rocks is through weathering. And remember, weathering is where certain gases are given off and the rock is broken down because it's subjected to its surrounding environment. Okay, so again, just a reminder that coal is considered a long-term storage for carbon, and biomass is considered a short-term storage for carbon. Okay, what we're going to look at now is how carbon actually moves through the different steps. And historically, remember that the Earth was once a volcanic surface, and the volcanic activity actually filled the atmosphere with a lot of sulfuric gases and carbon dioxide, and so there were very little amounts of oxygen. This all changed once we started getting more photosynthetic organisms that were able to change carbon dioxide into oxygen. So this brings us to the more current sources of how CO2 moves or carbon moves between the different steps of the carbon cycle. The first one we've already alluded to is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is really the opposite of respiration in a lot of ways, because photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and actually ends up changing it into oxygen and what we call glucose, which is C6H12O6. And that's a sugar for the plant to use in order to live and make its own energy. The opposite of this would be respiration, and that is what organisms who need to breathe use, like we use respiration. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, which is one of our waste products. So that's one of the more current sources of how CO2 moves. Another source on how CO2 moves is organic decay. And this is how, again, biomass actually holds a certain amount of carbon, and then once it dies, then carbon is free to leave the biomass in a certain rate. The last one that we're going to look at is the combustion of organic materials, and this includes, guys, the burning and decay of biomass that will actually place carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And also when we burn fossil fuels, like in our cars or in industry, that will also place carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay guys, something to keep in mind is that when we look at carbon and fossil fossil fuels take a long time to actually form, and we're looking at millions of years. But carbon actually becomes a sediment first, and we've talked about sediments. They're usually little bits and pieces of things. Once carbon becomes a sediment, then these carbon-rich deposits will end up in the earth, and after millions and millions of years, then they will actually become fossil fuels like coal. And we talked about fossil fuels, and we've talked about coal, and we talked about them together and how we use them in our daily lives, and also how it affects the air that we breathe. So again, when you burn fossil fuels, you're actually releasing carbon dioxide into the air. So we know that carbon dioxide is, in its gaseous form, released back into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuel. This also occurs when we actually burn biomass. So carbon dioxide is going to be released back into the atmosphere when we burn biomass. Okay, so discussing how carbon and marine animals actually end up interacting with each other. Again, the organisms that have shells are going to interact with the carbon cycle. We have what we call biocarbonate ions, and this is just another form of carbon. Biocarbonate ions are produced from weathered rock. And when we have, again, weathered rock, it's possible for the carbon to be released into the ocean. What it could do, the biocarbonate ions could actually form a shell. These shells are actually formed by calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate includes carbon, calcium, and oxygen. So once it's formed in the shell, the organism lives with a shell on its back, and until it dies, then it's going to be its shell. But after it dies, calcium carbonate is actually going to turn into a sediment. Usually it's going to be limestone, because limestone is actually made of this substance. And again, limestone can actually be subjected to a weathering process. And again, when we did our rock cycle, we looked at limestone. And limestone, when it's subjected to the weathering process, will actually produce a gas. And remember, guys, that gas is carbon dioxide. Okay, guys, so that concludes this section of the carbon cycle. And if you have any questions, write them down. We'll talk about them in class. And I will see you tomorrow.